On this episode of Vini Cause, we're in St. Lucia, home to the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States Commission, to talk about investing in agriculture. Rising food costs, our dependency on imported produce, and our long-term food security have become pressing issues in the region. This is compounded by the effects of climate change and the struggle to diversify our agricultural crops. As regional governments and non-governmental organizations invest in sustainable farming, renewable energy, and climate change, farming communities tackle stringent standards tests and diminishing export market opportunities. Today, we consider how do we diversify and integrate the agricultural sector in the Eastern Caribbean to ensure it is financially viable, sustainable, and eco-friendly.
Come talk, come chat, come listen. Vini Cause. Let's talk integration, one OECS region. Antigua, Vini Cause, Anguilla, Vini Cause, BVI, Dominica, Vini Cause, Grenada, Vini Cause, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Montserrat, Martinique, Vini Cause.
Given that agriculture is a science or practice of farming, primarily to produce food, I'd like to begin this discussion by inviting the panelists to briefly share their respective views on what has been the recent demand for food.
What we are seeing for the Caribbean is an increase in the food import bill. Our food import bill is over $4 billion a year, US dollars per year, and it's increasing. For most of the countries, about 85% of the food that we consume is imported. And we're talking about processed carbohydrates, foods that are high in sugar and fats. There's a lot of meat being imported, lamb and goat meat, beef. If you walk around the streets of the Caribbean, you see a lot of vendors selling apples, plums, pears, grapes. The fact that they're selling it means that there's a demand for it. So fruits and vegetables, processed foods, meats, big milk and meat, they're high imports and it's continuing to grow.
Continuing to grow.
Yeah.
Mr. Barry Innocent, the Deputy Director of Agricultural Services here in St. Lucia, give us a brief overview of the demand for food at the national level here in St. Lucia.
There are specific crops that seem to be in greater demand than others, both from the hotel's perspective and also the supermarket perspective. And based on the data we've collected from local purchases of supermarket goods, I would say melons, from watermelons, muskmelons, honeydew melons, to lettuce, cabbage, pineapples, and to a certain extent, loads of root crops. Fruits and fruits, in terms of fruit trees like mangoes and guava and those sort, because they're seasonal, you have an up and down trend. But I think the main thing would be, the main crops would be the vegetable group of lettuce, melons, sweet peppers, tomatoes, and carrots.
Thank you for that. I want to jump straight to the private sector representative. Your portfolio include a cluster of businesses within the agri-business development sector. What is the demand looking like within that cluster?
In terms of what's happening in northeast Grenada, which is geographically the rural part of Grenada, agriculture and what it produces has primarily been for the inhabitants of these neighborhoods. The average household grew up in this agrarian mode where they had to produce food to feed their families. Today that continues. The demand for tourism, yes, has also meant that we have to diversify a bit to supply the hotels and revenue.
But in terms of the demand, Are there specific crops that you are now seeing a demand for, or is there a general increase in demand across all crops, multi-crops?
Well, I would say for us, demand for what we call organic crops is actually surging. Our visitors are demanding better quality food, traceability, right? And they have, especially the new demographic of tourists that are, let's say, more the millennials or those that are a little bit more socially conscious. They are concerned about where their food comes from, who benefits from that, and our rums in particular, which we now classify as boutique rums or boutique agricultural rum because of the method that we actually use to create our rums. We can't compete on volume, but certainly on quality.
Yes.
That's where the emphasis is on. So there is a demand for that type of product in the food area.
And are you seeing that trickling down, Mr. Blanchard? I know Mr. Green's contribution was specific to Grenada, but I would imagine that across the region there isn't much of a disparity. And I'm wondering if at your level, if the farmers are benefiting or seeing that trickling effect from the increase in the demand for organic food and products.
Yes, there is a growing demand for organic foods. And what we have been trying to do, based on the demand that has been placed, we are trying to develop an organic chapter within the next 5 years in this country to ensure that we meet the demands of those persons. However, there are challenges, but we know that we can cause it to happen by virtue of effective planning and development from our very perspective.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Blanchard. Mrs. Nurse, you're representing the organization of women producers, CANRA. Yes. And I'm wondering, how does it differ in terms of the demands that you are experiencing, the demands for food? How does it differ from maybe what Mr. Blanchard has just explained?
I don't think there is much of a difference because our focus too is on the use of organic food, production of organic food. However, we have a wider focus where we are looking at promoting foods, growing and promoting foods that will meet the demands of the tourists who come in to have a taste of the Caribbean. Our focus is having a Caribbean taste, and also the traditional foods that are not readily in the supermarket. We have a focus in terms of the production and processing of those crops.
And who would be your clientele? Are you catering to a domestic market, or you are supplying this demand for an external, regional, and even international market at your level?
Presently, heavy on domestic because of the lack of funding and facilities to do substandard processing that would be required by the market. So the demand is presently we are catering for the domestic market.
There's also a new thrust. So for example, crops like cassava, which once upon a time seem to have undergone some kind of a downward turn in recent times because of re-education of the public and trying to replace it, or replace, let's say, some of the imported cereals that we are now saying, okay, so, cassava could be a good replacement for oats and for barley and the other things that we normally import. We have farmers now who are actually producing such, creating cassava flour, which is now going into bakeries and making breads, right? And kind of adding more value to some of the traditional crops that we used to have, keeping in mind the limitations.
So education is the key for the change, which also brings, I want to sanction something Mr. Simon said about the introduction of the cassava into the wheat flour for the reduction of the importation of wheat. But we look at the culture here in St. Lucia, where they were accustomed to the bitter cassava, the introduction of the sweet cassava, they still have that concept that it's not good for food as a food. And so until we can change all those notions, we will still be where we are right now in the mindset.
I just want to make two quick comments. I think that when we're talking about introducing the varieties of say, cassava, whether bitter or sweet, things should be demand-driven, should be market-led if we want these certain commodities to catch on. And I think something that we need to recognize, ultimately, there are these macro issues. The enabling environment is critical, yes, but we need more entrepreneurship. People who are willing to run with the initiatives. Because there are a lot of opportunities out there. We talk about import substitution. There are a lot of opportunities to fulfill this gap that is there instead of importing food. But we need persons to come on board who are willing to take up these opportunities. And I think that's where the institutions like ICA, FAO, CARDI, the ministry, etc. have been working together, collaborating to develop investment plans, investment packages that allow the private sector to come on board to take advantage of these opportunities. I myself, I got into farming because I saw opportunities.
What is happening to our agricultural sector? I mean, if the demand is there, then how does that correlate to our agricultural sector?
Unfortunately, we're not seeing the commensurate growth in the agricultural sector. Traditionally in the Caribbean, our agricultural sector was based on some strong pillars. Sugar, bananas, and in the old days, rice. Those pillars are no longer because we got good prices for them, there was a steady income, so a lot of farmers were involved in agriculture. Those pillars are no more. We have not found the commodities to replace those pillars. So you find that there is low productivity in a number of the commodities that are being promoted to replace sugar, rice, bananas.
I wanted to invite a comment from Mr. Alcy from the OECS with regards to the contribution of agriculture to the GDP in the OECS.
So something I call GDP, gross deceptive product, because it really doesn't tell you what the contribution of agriculture really and truly is. GDP is done through the measurement of national accounts, and national accounts only takes into consideration the formal transactions. So the agro-processing, the people in the community markets, the central market, that is not captured in GDP. What is captured is exports, supermarket sales, hotel sales, formal transactions. Like I said, the whole question of GDP is relative. So you might find, like in Dominica, Dominica doesn't have a strong tourism sector like St. Lucia.
Right.
So you find that agriculture might be, relative to other sectors, manufacturing and so on, agriculture might be the leading one.
Yes, 15.8%.
Right. Now, if you look at, then you may even want to look at the revenue, which contributes to GDP. So St. Lucia with maybe a 5% GDP, the revenue to agriculture, they might even be more than the 15%.
When the woman, for example, at home who is growing her food in the backyard and is feeding her children with it and making tamban balls and sugar cake and selling and educating her children from primary all the way to university through that cycle of agricultural or value-added agricultural cottage-based industries. That is never factored into the GDP, for example, of the average country here. We don't see that.
Right.
So that value is never attached to it, but it is there.
It's cheaper to buy cheap and sell expensive. The private sector, a lot of the private sector involved in the food industry is doing just that. And that causes a lot of problems for our local farmers because the cost of production is so high.
And therefore, we tend to gravitate towards the imported product over the agriculture. Mr. Green,
Now,
is the private sector guilty of buying cheap and promoting those products to maximize profit margin at the expense of perhaps local farmers?
some of that could be accurate. On the flip side of the coin, I think we also did a very terrible job over the last 2 or 3 decades in the Caribbean of stigmatizing agriculture as something that people who have no other recourse in life ends up doing, as opposed to a business. But when you think back about the history of the Caribbean, the most wealth that was ever made in this region was in the period of colonialism, when you had sugar, coffee, cocoa, all these different things being produced in the region, and it made Europe wealthy. Somehow we're told that somehow agriculture does not make economic sense. We just started to think of making chocolate. There's not one cocoa tree growing in Europe and North America, but yet the connoisseurs or the chocolate makers of the world, that's where they're located.
Yes.
And chocolate is one of the most expensive agricultural commodity in the world, if you think of it. We are still not educating our people about those possibilities.
I think what has happened, agriculture being the main foreign exchange earner in the earlier years, generated that kind of foreign exchange, that kind of revenue, which really built other sectors. And if you look around the region, you would see that. But what happened to agriculture then and up until now is that the type of investment that was required back into agriculture was never put into agriculture. And I think agriculture is still suffering from that lack of reinvestment up to today. Because what agriculture requires, as we talk about food imports bill, as we talk about meeting demands, is that type of reinvestment into agriculture to make that change.
There's need for diversification. The labor force in agriculture is an aging labor force. Most of the countries, it's over 50, 60 years old. The youth are not interested in agriculture. There's also issues related to governance. And I'm saying governance, not government, meaning that the systems that need to be put in place, the enabling environment, the legislation, the infrastructure, all of these things are not there to encourage people into agriculture.
Whereas Dr. Paul is correct in terms that there's elements of youth that show no interest in agriculture, but I wouldn't say all youth, because in our Youth Agricultural Enterprise Project, when we first promoted it and asked for applicants to apply to be a part of that project, we had over 400 applicants. And then we shortlisted to 175. 400 youth in St. Lucia applied.
Okay.
And we shortlisted it to 175. And right now we have 150 because of limited resources. So there are some youths interested, not all, but there are some interested.
Thank you so much. At this point in time, I'd like to invite some input from the audience. If there are any questions at this time, yes? Discussion.
The point is this, that government must want agriculture to work for agriculture to work.
Right.
They must create the environment for agriculture to work. You understand? The other point is that in St. Lucia, it's not a matter of young people not wanting to go into agriculture. The problem is the young people have seen what has happened to their parents before them. They would produce their crops and it goes to market. If it goes to the hotels, they're going to take 60, 90 days to pay you. So you cannot continue your production, number one.
But another point made to the historical position with farming is that a lot of wealth was generated by their parents through agriculture.
That is true, but let us look at where the wealth was generated and to whom it was generated for.
Okay.
When we look at the banana industry, who were the people really benefited from the banana industry, from the heydays of the banana industry? It wasn't the small farmers who were taking care of the bananas and planting them, you know? From the heydays of the banana industry, it wasn't the small farmers who were taking care of the bananas and planting them.
Good afternoon. Just to add to the discussion, I think one of our very big issues locally, I would say, is with our land use policy going even to that effect. Because there are many young persons now who would like to go into agriculture, and acquiring land is an issue. Years ago, the size of the plots of agricultural land was much larger than what it is now. You have a reduction in your ability to acquire certain economies of scale because of the size of those plots. The youth generation now is very technological, and we need to find a way to mesh the technological interests with agriculture to get those young persons involved. We have to remember our topography as an island, and we need to be more creative in how we make use of our lands here in St. Lucia. That's my contribution. Thank you.
I wanted to read some information that I came across very interesting and find very interesting and perhaps worthy of sharing with the rest of the audience. It says here, in the Caribbean, Caribbean agriculture operates on the various natural and cultural restraints. Most of the islands have rugged terrain, restricting productive agriculture to river valleys and coastal plains, and typically less than 1/3 of an island's land area is suitable for crops. Less than 1/3. So do we have a problem with land use and land space for the kind of agriculture that is required to satisfy both the domestic market and the export market?
Well, there is definitely an issue because, as the young man definitely said, and most of the farms we have are hillside farming, and it restricts certain mechanization units from being installed. That would make it easier for the farmers. That's definitely an issue. But I think we as small island development states, since it's a burning issue, I don't think it's something that we should be afraid of or practice any fear of. I think what needs to be looked at is application of knowledge, because there are things that could happen where you can use wires and you put a hook on it and you can use to send things down. It can actually work in our favor, but not much creative activity has happened in light of this.
Thank you. The gentleman over here. I've been promising to collect his contribution for a while.
In reference to poultry in St. Lucia, all right? We have in the U.S. where the U.S. government is subsidizing heavily the poultry industry. We also speak about dumping, anti-dumping laws and all those things. Yet still, we can import chicken out of the U.S. in St. Lucia for as much as 11 cents U.S., 10 cents U.S., and based on what type of chicken you buy, at 5 cents U.S. There is no place in the world where chicken can be produced for that price. But yet still, it is happening. What is the government doing about it?
We have also experienced a demand for a lot of chicken, right? Though we have a local production of chicken, you still have a lot of importation happening. And we are currently looking into that and see how we can make things happen in a positive way.
But what is preventing us from becoming self-sufficient in poultry production? What is preventing us from doing that?
Well, we are self-sufficient in table eggs, for sure. However, with the broilers or chicken meat, we have a few challenges I would call it more social challenges. It's more to do with the groups and how they manage their group dynamics, and more so the cost of feed is a major issue for livestock producers. And we are currently in discussions with our sole feed manufacturing plant in St. Lucia to see how we can work with them to bring the cost of feed down.
Thank you. The gentleman over here.
We have very limited land resources for commercial agriculture. If you have limited land resources, all the governments of the islands have to agree that it's a war you're fighting, so that the limited land resource that you have is in fact a strategic resource. And if you recognize that that is a strategic resource, then you have to do certain things. And first thing that you have to do is to make sure that you have a proper land use policy.
Right.
That land use policy must be strictly adhered to. For example, in St. Lucia, to give you an example, the limited Class 1 lands that we have are being encroached significantly for other things. So that the policies of the government have to be in such a way that they actually prevent persons who are in possession of those lands for utilizing it for non-agricultural purposes.
Thank you so much for your contribution. Mr. Innocent, I want to ask you, is this just a matter of political will, or this situation is multifaceted?
It's multifaceted. The land use policy is a draft document, and it was limited in some areas. And it got also affected because there was issues of the considerations for land zoning, which was perceived to be would be married into the land policy document. So right now there is an interagency group that is meeting on the land policy document to bring it to its finalization and then for officiation.
I just wanted to respond to the young man's comment about land, because FAO has now started a land bank. Alex George mentioned it too. A project to develop a land bank in 3 Caribbean countries: Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So the land banks project is looking at it from the point of view of the persons who are producing, but also from the government in terms of the lease management system. FAO has had a long history of land use planning and providing countries with support for developing land policies. And the new arrangements, the new approach to it now is not one where government imposes a particular policy on the groups, but it is a process of negotiation, because some of that land is owned by a private landowner. And basically, the government may not necessarily be able to tell the guy what use you can and cannot put to your land. He might decide, I'm making more money in housing. Who are you to tell me to keep it in agriculture if it's privately owned land? So we have learned that from experiences in other countries, land use planning and developing of land zones is a process of negotiation involving all the stakeholders who are involved in the process.
At this stage, I want to introduce the first video that looks at how one young person is realizing his dream to enter into the agricultural business space and to face the challenge of land use and everything else.
I am James Alphonse, the owner of Greenhaven Fresh Farm, pretty much this establishment. Greenhaven is an integrated farm. I grow in aquaponics and also in greenhouses and open field production. This is the aquaponic version of the farm where I grow tilapia, shrimps, and vegetables in the same system. It's pretty much a recycled ecosystem, enclosed with the water recycling. Aquaponics is a combination of hydroponics and aquaculture. Aquaculture is raising fish in water. Hydroponics is growing vegetables using nutrients. So in this system, the combination of the two, the fish waste, it provides the nutrients for the plants, and the plants in turn filter the water for the fish. Well, aquaponics is all green. No chemicals is used in the system. If you apply any chemical to the plants, it will affect the fish. So it's all green, no added chemicals in there. This system estimated to yield 3,500 pounds of lettuce on a monthly basis at the peak production. And in terms of fish, on an annual basis, this system can harvest 12,000 pounds of fish. The misperception is farming is dirty. Farming is like the way cultivating the land. But you don't have to cultivate the land to be in farming. You could be innovative and be in farming. Like me, I have the aquaponics, I have the greenhouse. I did not choose to go the route of open field production, cultivating the land. So I basically eliminate a lot of the intense labor and condense it into controlled environment, controlled setting, and maximize the use of it. In this system, I grow vertical beds, another means of maximizing production per square foot. So I don't need to go out there mass production to be farming. This is also farming. Farming is a science. Like anything else with science, the laws are there. So once you do what's required, you will yield the results. The first investment was $60,000 when I started with the 2 greenhouses and open field production. The initial investment of $60,000 paid off for the 2 greenhouses within a short space of time. The greenhouses were quite successful. Like I said, I managed to maintain consistent production in tomatoes. One of my customers wanted me to grow lettuce for them, and I did some research, and this led me to aquaponics. Prior to going into aquaponics, I had an issue with water. Well, my farm prior to that was on Wasco water. You hardly get water, so sometimes you find out to truck water on a weekly basis, and this increased the cost of production. So I designed a plot to build a water tank, and then next plan was how to use it. And that plan has evolved into aquaponics. There are many other designs or plans in terms of what I do, and I ended up settling with aquaponics, which I feel was the best bet for the money. I have eliminated my water bill altogether. However, I got an additional bill. With the aquaponics, the system needs to recycle, so I have added in electricity bill. So basically, I need power 24/7 to circulate the water and also generate air and blow air in the water, aerate the water. The plan is to get solar panels, solar power. Definitely, with the solar, the system will be totally sustainable. So it harvests its own water, it harvests its own electricity, and it just pretty much produce for itself. This system costs $300,000. There is a water tank at the base of this, costs half of it 150,000. The water tank is 7 feet deep. It's 40 feet wide by 60 feet long, with a storage capacity of 80,000 gallons of water. And this water is used in the aquaponics and also used in the nearby greenhouses and open field production. It is quite sad that we import a lot of foods we can grow locally. For example, lettuce. We import most of the lettuce we consume. There are opportunities in agriculture, and governments and commercial banks should invest in agriculture and look at it closely. There are opportunities there, and to yield the better result, it requires investment. And with those investments, the results will follow.
Right. So a direct example of innovation at work, young people being interested in agriculture, young people looking at ways in which they can make it viable and proving that it can be a success story. Mr. Innocent, why aren't we seeing much more of this?
Well, I'm glad you asked, to be honest. Well, early on, if you remember, when the young man spoke, I did say that there are young people already showing a lot of interest in it. The main constraint is capital. Some of these youth getting a loan, as Ms. Daniel mentioned earlier on, to go into such enterprises. And currently, we are having discussions with SLDB and a few other financial institutions to see if they can help us provide the initial capital and the financial support, the credit lines for young people to go into these resources. We had one young man that he didn't go into aquaponics or hydroponics, but he went into virgin coconut oil production. And he has now employed about 5 other youth working with him. And it's quite successful. We're doing things, but our hands are limited in terms of the amount of resources we have to work with.
Okay. At this stage, I want to introduce the Belmont story in Grenada, how they have basically revitalized their own product to survive in the agriculture sector.
My name is Alicia Sorrell. I am the tourism manager here at Belmont Estate. Belmont Estate is a fair trade certified agri-tourism business. It dates back to the late 1600s. Its products offers include the organic farm, restaurant tours, a museum which has now become the chocolate factory, and gardens. We have now gone into the non-traditional, so we're looking at both the citrus and the vegetables. The byproducts that we're experimenting with, the goat cheese, the value-added products, such as the mango pepper sauce, the breadfruit pickle, the tamarind, the kuchila, basically all the vegetables, fruits that we have on the estate. We're looking at converting it and looking at other value-added products. We're aiming to utilize the market potential, offering premium chocolates within an agri-tourism setting. We're looking at single source, which will be from the tree to the table. Everything will be made right here on the estate. The goat cheese, it actually spun off of a non-profit project. There they were looking at the low-income farmers, looking at the goat production and the use of their milk. Okay, because it is becoming more popular, it is a bit more healthier than cow's milk.
The locals are gradually getting into the goat cheese. It's very new to Grenada, and Grenadians are accustomed to everything imported from somewhere else. So it's a thing that is coming into all locals. They're accepting it, but it's very slowly.
Because they sometimes look at local products and say it might be inferior. And I think we have to change the mindset.
Sometimes it could be an acquired taste too, so it's a little time to get them to get accustomed to the taste of the goat cheese and to know that, okay, we could do it by ourselves.
We need to have other farmers involved, letting them know the potential of the goat cheese. And I think that, if Belmont Estate spearheads this initiative, I think that we could introduce a new generation of farmers with goat cheese. There is a regional demand for goat cheese. However, the production has been too small to meet the overall demand. We also have to look at the excessive distance, which makes the product expensive to ship. We have to look at refrigeration. We currently want to excel with our domestic operation first before we could look at our export. Based on my research, I saw in 2015, Grenada recorded a 6% reduction in their food import bill. But I think one of the sentiments expressed by myself and as well as our managing director is looking for more acceptance from the locals with the local market and the local products.
That contribution from Belmont Estate, and we thank them for participating in this discussion through that pre-filmed segment. A couple of issues coming out of that video. Mr. Innocent, Grenada recorded a 6% reduction in their food import bill. Are you seeing any kind of similar trend here in St. Lucia?
The reduction in the food import bill in Grenada, it is something that the ministry is currently looking into. We have identified various crops that we have a comparative advantage to grow successfully.
What would it take for us to really start making a dent in the food import bill? To make Grenada's success story a trend?
At the national levels, in all the countries, you would need to give agriculture the requisite support services, right? And these support services would mean relevant technical support, budgetary allocations, and we can go on and on. Right. And even at the farm level to help improve productivity, because our situation, one of our main challenges is supply side, issues of the supply side. Low productivity, small acreages, pest and disease, and so on. So we need to have all those support services available to assist the farming population.
I want to deal with the question of the import bill, but what I think we should be doing is to see to what extent that we can reduce and whatever areas that we can reduce on the bill, because the food import bill is composed of a lot of foods that we cannot grow in the Caribbean. Flour, for example, is one example. So one would have to study very carefully the actual structure of that import bill and then to choose those areas where we can probably make a dent. Particularly those areas that relate to the growing tourism trade, so that the agricultural sector can benefit in linkages with the tourism industry.
Mr. Blanchard, I'm thinking goat cheese is something, it's such an acquired taste, it's not something we're used to, here in the domestic market. But do you see that as an attractive option as a farmer?
Culturally, we have been involved in the production of goats, and we have seen a proliferation of goat production in St. Lucia, to the extent that there is presently an association of small ruminants, of which goat is developing. There is a potential for goat cheese to be on the market and for us to develop.
And we've been talking a lot about the food import bill, the cost of food and everything during the past 2 hours. And I was wondering if the concept of a kitchen garden has somehow left the Caribbean culture. Have kitchen gardens become too elitist now?
For many, yes. For a few, it still remains. But I think that's one of the areas to get a change in terms of food supply. If we can start from the family, from the bottom up, we can get the change in terms of the demand for food. But I also want to mention at this time, whilst we look at the demand for food, the food waste is very high, extremely high. Extremely high. And so education become again important, and we need more programs such as this to inform, because the airway really make a very significant impact on the lives of individuals. And if we can have programs like this and other programs being aired, especially during critical time, it will change mindsets of individuals and cause us to use more of what we produce.
I really wanted to bring up the point about governments and the important role that a government plays in agricultural development. Throughout all of the countries, what we've seen, all the data suggests that government
allocate less and less of the national budget towards agriculture. And so you have decreasing investments coming out from governments, and so it will trickle down to farmers. You have low investments, you'll have a low output. The other thing is it's very difficult for a farmer to get a loan with any kind of concessionary terms so that they can push their own agricultural enterprise. So I think we must not ever, even with the decreasing land space, there's so much more. If you have you have reached the maximum, what else can you do? Only innovation and research can really take you beyond that. And for you to get innovation and research and make the most use of that limited space you have, you need additional investment in agriculture. And so we need to see a reverse of the trend that governments increasingly put less and less money into agriculture.
Thank you for that contribution. The issue of support for farmers has come up quite a bit. Let's hear from the farmers. Mrs. Nurse, do you feel supported enough by national policies, by private sector, by the local population?
Supported, yes. Supported enough, no. We're not supported enough. I represent here the grassroots organization.
Yes.
And when we think about the grassroots, I don't know who coined the name, but as women, we represent the root that is often covered up of a plant. But the grass still grows. And as women, we have been planting, growing, and making a difference as relates to family life and contributing to the GDP, was mentioned earlier, but not recognized. We saw the need now for those individuals to come together and have a structured organization. The Caribbean Network of Rural Women Producers comprises of 12 chapters. It comprises of rural women who are in farming because they are rooted in farming and they're not leaving it despite climate change or whatever change, they are growing and feeding. But there are many things that we cannot do. For instance, in St. Lucia, we have been waiting for over 4 years. There was a processing plan to get our products on the market in massive stores and also to the region. But we cannot produce unless we have the standards. So we are limited. We are producing, but in limited quantities. So, not making the type of difference we really want to make.
So what I'm hearing is that you are basically kept at a cottage level.
Yes.
Mr. Blanchard, how would you summarize the support that farmers get at your level, small to medium-sized farmers that would make up your cooperative?
Honestly, we're not satisfied with the level of support. We are convinced that there's not the conviction by the government or the kind of support that is to be given because they have not created the enabling environment for things to happen. One, in terms of agriculture and all the other sectors must be policy-driven. The policy of agriculture has not been well established to ensure that you have to operate and you must do X, Y, and Z. For example, the issue of damming the rivers. Water is going to be the next world war. Regards how do we prepare our country for the water war in our development? So it means that we have to begin the infrastructure or the responsibility of government is to build infrastructure whereby the farmers cannot.
I want to say in response very quickly that the government funds are not at the best that they would want it to be. We cannot give everything, we understand, but we provide some level of support. Currently, we are having discussions with SLDB and a few other financial institutions to see if they can help us provide the initial capital and the financial support, the credit lines for young people to go into these resources. That's one. Two, the farmers, the government is trying the best with the farmers in light of our limited resources. But what we are doing is we are providing at least the concessions. If farmers are bringing in items, inputs, whether it's agro-processing, machinery, vehicles, and what the government does is provide concessions where they get sometimes 100% import duty-free, excise tax, service charge. All of this is removed to make it easier for the farmer. And there are technical expertise provided. We're doing things, but our hands are limited in terms of the amount of resources we have to work with.
The regional organizations have spent quite a bit of money in agriculture, governments too, on agriculture. What I would like to get a sense of, what are these organizations doing to ensure that the percentage of these funds that actually go to the real, where the real effort is needed, where the assistance is needed, as we have heard in the crowd, that percentage increases? I was involved in a project at one time, and I could assure you that more than 70% of the monies went towards consultancies, which is still studying the problem, if you're talking consultancies, as well as administrative work around the problem. And less than 30% would go towards the real problem. So what are the organizations doing to ensure that this percentage at least moves up marginally?
Thank you. Mr. Glean, I wanted to get some input from you from the point of view of ICA. What are some of the projects that ICA has supported in the OECS that you've probably seen a return on investment on?
Like any other agency, our program is driven by what is happening out there in the environment. And we recognize the issues of the rising food import bill and the need to reduce it, the need to improve productivity and increase production generally. And as a result, we have various instruments of action that allow us to achieve some of those goals. And my colleagues at the OECS and Ms. Daniel may be able to tell you about their inter-regional shipping initiative. And through that intervention by ICA, we hope to see increased interregional trade, sharing information on how to access the markets, the various market regulations, etc. And also allowing more national coordination of agricultural health and food safety. So those were the two externally funded projects. Yes. And also we have 4 flagship projects. And I'll try to be very brief. One looks at inclusion to address climate change related issues, land use management, water use, etc. Family farming to help the disadvantaged groups that are out there, to help them to negotiate and to get more involved in production and advocacy. There's also the whole issue of value chains, which I'm directly involved with.
I don't think the issue is whether or not the organizations provide the support. I think the tangible evidence is there. What we want to know is it working? Is it making a difference? And how do you measure it?
Yeah, I agree with you. The measurement of the impact has to be in terms of what is happening on the ground with the farmers. Are their incomes increasing? Right. Is their livelihood increasing? Right. Are they more resilient, especially in the face of climate change and hurricanes and so on? So we ourselves are looking at a different way. In the past, it was how much money we were putting into it. But now it's a case of what is happening to the people who matter the most. And more importantly, the people who have been left behind. Talking from the point of view of the United Nations and the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the key messages is no one left behind.
So has mobility
so in terms of yes, in terms of the poor, the vulnerable, what are we seeing in terms of the number of people who are poor and vulnerable who are being now moved out of poverty? And that is the measure of our success.
Right. Thank you. At this point, I would like to allow some more audience input.
Good afternoon to all. My name is Dunstan DeMille, and I'm here representing Massey. Also, I'm a director on the Caribbean Agribusiness Association, which is CABA. And let me start by thanking OECS and the EU for having such a discussion. I think the region, we have missed so many opportunities, and it's time we start turning the table around so that we could get those opportunities. Youth in agriculture, we miss our opportunity. We had the youth all excited. What happened? By the time we were ready to implement the program, by then the euro had dropped. They don't have the amount of finances that they have. So one of the things that we have to, one of the messages we have to keep is timeliness. We want to move things around our region. We have a golden opportunity we seem to be forgetting. America cannot produce food all year round, right? They have autumn, winter, and spring. We can do that in the Caribbean. We can. We as Massey, we have a program I think I haven't seen anywhere in the region. We give loans to farmers without a cent interest, a cent deposit. Why? Because we understand the challenges that farmers face. A lot of them do not farm on their own land. A lot of families are dysfunctional. So they cannot even get the papers for the loan to allow them to get a loan.
Very valid points. Dr. Fletcher Paul, we have a trough basically wiping out farms, and then we have these long dry spells where drought, has basically destroyed production as well. So what is the position with crop insurance for farmers in the region?
Okay, we are actually about to implement a project in 3 OECS countries, Grenada, well, 2 of them, one's in Grenada, one's in Vincent Grenadines, and one which is non-OECS, which is Jamaica, looking at innovative crop insurance systems. Because what we have found, the crop insurance systems in the Caribbean require a large, well, first of all, the farmers have to contribute, and also the governments. We are looking at innovative systems of crop insurance now. For example, with the CRIF, we are looking at what they call parametric insurance schemes, which are based not on estimation of loss, but estimation of weather path, for example, systems with the weather which trigger you to pay. For example, if the wind speed goes above a certain level, the farmers will be paid a certain amount. But it requires a certain discipline in the farmers to agree to contribute to such schemes.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Glean, any closing words from you, sir? Closing comments.
Yeah, we heard a lot today, and I want to go back to something that you mentioned, the whole issue of value chains. And the value chain talks about the various activities that are involved in moving the commodities from production to the actual consumer, or the range of actors involved. But bottom line is about value creation. And if we talk about value, what is value? It's about the sharing of the risk, the challenges with delivering your produce. How can we facilitate better transportation, contract farming, all those things? We have to consider what is value to each player in the chain.
Mr. Innocent, the closing floor. It is yours as the host state of Vini Causse and as the representative in the local chair.
I'll just say 2 things very quickly. One, I believe in closing that there is need for a spirit of the patriot, right? And a spirit of togetherness. I believe that there's need for the banks, the insurance companies, all the relevant stakeholders that can make things happen. All of us, including the farmers, can remove individualism of thinking, or thinking of them of self, and think of togetherness and community thinking. If we can get some banks that are willing to come on board and allow the credit facilitation and financing needed in the spirit of a patriot, and some insurance companies, I've had discussions with a few insurance companies, but I'm still not getting the feedback I want. And the second thing is, I want to thank you all for coming here today and for your various contributions. Let us not give up. I still feel where there's a will, there's a way, and I still believe that there's a lot we can do in spite of our limitations.
Thank you very much. We thank the public for coming out today. We thank you for your contribution.
Agriculture is a very viable business, and it is going to continue to play a critical role in the development of the OECS. So let us address the dynamics of it holistically. Every single government understands the importance of food security and food sovereignty. But at the end of the day, citizens make a very important choice as to what they invest in. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the government doesn't have an estate that produces crops. What the government does is that it creates the enabling environment for citizens to invest. And you may say that, well, the government is probably putting more of its investment into tourism. But what is pertaining now is that tourism is more attractive as a foreign direct investor earner. So you have large companies coming into St. Lucia, into St. Vincent and the Grenadines, into Grenada, to invest in the hotel industry. We do not see this taking place as it pertains to agriculture. The allocation of resources in the Ministry of Agriculture throughout the OECS is based on the need for technical support for the most part. So let's use, for example, the Banana Services Unit in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's allocated $6 million every year. Last year it was down to about 5.5, down to about 4. None of that money is going into actually planting a banana plant. It is the private sector which is making the investment into the actual production. So when we look at the allocations by the government, even in tourism, you have to run your tourism authority, you have to do your marketing, but the government isn't building hotels. Governments and policymakers would make decisions based on the variables which are in front of them. So it's not something that the government and the public sector is seeing as the only stakeholder in the game determining the food import bill. The taste of the citizens, the willingness to cooperate with other stakeholders to purchase what is produced locally, the ability of producers to produce efficiently and have their production levels to the extent that they do not price their food out of the pockets of the citizens. We have to thrive to take the food import bill down to a number approaching 0. But there will be some very hard pillars that we cannot erase. And it will be difficult for us to erase those items which we have to put into the tourism sector. It is going to be hard for us to erase the throughput that we have to feed the factories. But what I see taking place in the not too distant future, and what has already started in some of the islands, Dr. Didicus Jules is leading an excellent initiative from the center, the OECS Agri-Shipping Initiative. Because the question is, if an island has a strength in a particular area, then why not those countries that have a greater comparative advantage to produce food go into extra food production to supply those countries and those internal markets in the OECS, which are heavily dependent on imported food because of their growing tourism industry. And the Agri-Shipping Initiative, what it does is that it provides the mechanism. The boats are already available. The boats are already moving. For example, St. Vincent and the Grenadines last week exported 700 heads of cattle to Grenada. All the spices that we want in St. Vincent, we are going to depend on Grenada for those spices. And we want better maritime transportation to move produce intra-OECS. And that is going to add greater validity to the investment that we are advocating to go into agriculture. Because we have the markets here. We have the food import bill that is spiraling out of control. But if you produce the food on some islands that have a comparative advantage, but you don't move it to other islands, then we can't really harness the opportunities available to us in the OECS.
Come talk, come chat, come listen. Let's talk integration, one OECS region. Antigua, Vinicoze, Anguilla, Vinicoze, BVI, Dominica, Vinicoze, hey, Grenada, Vinicoze, St. Kitts, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Montserrat, Martinique, Vinicoze.
The OECS Public Education Forum Series, Vinicoze. Come chat to us, come talk to us, we're listening. Vinicoze is brought to you by the OECS 10th EDF Economic Integration and Trade of the OECS Region Project.
Vinicoze.